Welcome back to Books and Bites, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into, a pretty influential book in the realm of social psychology. Yeah. Elliot Aronson's The Social Animal. It's a book that's, helped generations of readers, I think, really kind of understand the often hidden forces that are at play when we interact with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those books that kind of sticks with you, right? Like you read it and you start to look at the world a little bit differently.
Absolutely. And that's really our aspiration for today's deep dive. We want to give you, the listener, a grasp of the core ideas from The Social Animal, but in a way that is hopefully both fun and, really gets you thinking.
Right.
So we're kind of aiming to be your shortcut, your express lane to understanding these really foundational principles in social psychology.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. How does Aronson define the fields of social psychology?
Well, he kind of frames it as the scientific study of how we think, how we feel, and how we behave.
In social situations. But really importantly, he puts a lot of emphasis on the impact of external factors. Right. So things like groups, cultural norms, people in positions of authority.
Yeah. That's a key point. Social psychology really highlights the power of the situation, right? I mean, the environment we're in shapes our behavior in ways that we often don't even realize.
Yeah. I think most of us tend to sort of think of ourselves as, independent agents.
Right.
We make our own decisions. We think for ourselves. But, Aronson really argues that, these sort of subtle, sometimes not so subtle social forces are constantly kind of tugging at us, right?
Absolutely. And one of the central ideas that he really drives home is that we as human beings, we systematically underestimate the power of these social influences. We tend to think that we're in control, that we're rational actors. But the reality is, our behavior is shaped by all sorts of things that we're not even aware of. And a perfect example of this is, what's called the fundamental attribution error.
The classic concept.
Can you sort of unpack what that is?
Sure. So the fundamental attribution error. This describes our tendency to overemphasize personality-based explanations for other people's behavior while underemphasizing situational explanations.
Okay.
So let me give you an example. Imagine you're driving down the road and some jerk cuts you off. What's your immediate reaction?
Oh, this guy's a total jerk.
Right. You immediately jump to the conclusion that this person is inconsiderate, right? They're a bad driver. It's something about their personality.
Yeah.
But what if you're the one who accidentally cuts someone off?
Oh, well, I didn't see them. I was in a hurry. It's not, doesn't mean anything about me as a person,
Exactly.
Circumstance.
So when we're evaluating our own behavior, we tend to focus on the situation.
Right.
Oh, I was late for a meeting, or I was distracted. But when we're evaluating other people's behavior, we tend to ignore the situation and we jump to conclusions about their character.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental attribution error in a nutshell. And it really illustrates how we can kind of fool ourselves into thinking that we're more rational and objective than we actually are.
It makes you wonder how many really sort of snap judgments we make about people.
Yeah, right.
Based on these, just super limited observations.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. It's so pervasive.
Now let's talk about conformity, which is something I think everybody's experienced in some form or another. This sort of tendency to follow the crowd. What is it that kind of compels us to do that from a psychological perspective?
Well, this is where, the work of Solomon Asch becomes really crucial, right?
Yeah.
And Aronson does such a great job of explaining these classic experiments. Do you want to lay out how they worked?
Yeah, sure. So imagine you're in a room with a bunch of other people and you're shown a line, right? A standard line.
Okay.
And then you're shown 3 other lines.
Okay.
Of varying length. And you have to say which of those 3 matches the standard line.
Okay.
It's a pretty simple task, right? The answer is obvious.
Seems straightforward.
Yeah. But here's the catch.
Right.
Everybody else in the room is an actor.
Ooh, okay.
And they've all been instructed to give the same wrong answer.
Interesting.
So now you're the only real participant. And you're sitting there and you see everybody else giving this answer that you know is wrong.
I see. So what happens to the participant in this scenario?
Well, what Asch found was that a significant number of the participants would actually go along with the group's incorrect answer.
Wow.
Even though it was clear to them.
They knew better.
They knew it was wrong, yeah.
So they conformed to the majority opinion.
They did. And Aronson talks about, a couple of different types of social influence, why this happens.
Right.
So normative social influence is basically our desire to fit in.
Okay.
Right. We want to be liked. We want to be accepted.
So it's about social approval.
It's about social approval, yeah.
Okay.
So we go along with the group, even if we disagree.
To avoid rocking the boat.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then there's informational social influence, which is, the idea that we might actually start to believe that the group has more information than we do.
I see.
And particularly if it's a situation that's ambiguous or uncertain, we kind of look to others as a source of information, and we assume that if everybody else is saying something, it must be true.
So in the Ashland experiment, the participant might actually start to question their own perception on, right?
Right.
Because everybody else is giving a different answer.
Right. And it's like, maybe I'm the one who's seeing this wrong,
Right. Am I crazy? Everyone else seems so confident.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a really powerful illustration of how, social cues can sometimes override our own senses and perceptions.
Yeah, so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, right, that Aronson points out that conformity isn't always a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, it's absolutely essential for society to function.
Right. We have to have some level of agreement on shared norms and rules.
We need to agree on things like laws and social etiquette.
Right, yeah.
Right, to live together peacefully. Otherwise, it would just be chaos.
Yeah. But at the same time, he cautions against blind conformity, right?
Right.
Because throughout history, we've seen, many, many examples of, people going along with really harmful social norms or blindly following the orders of, authoritarian leaders.
Right. And it can lead to really tragic outcomes.
It can, yeah. So it's really, I think for the listener, it's important to ask yourself, have you ever been in a situation where, you felt pressured to go along with a decision or an opinion, even though deep down you had your own doubts or reservations?
Absolutely. I mean, we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the human experience. But understanding these social influences can help us become more aware of when it might be happening and maybe make more conscious choices.
Right. It gives you that ability to step back a little bit.
Yeah.
And analyze the situation.
Yeah. Be a little more critical of what's going on.
Okay. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about, how our opinions and beliefs get shaped on a much larger scale, through mass persuasion.
Right.
So how do things like, media and political campaigns and advertising, how do those things exert their influence on us?
Yeah, this is a really crucial area, especially in today's world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are just bombarded with messages constantly from all directions.
Yeah.
And, one of the key insights from the social animal is that just presenting people with logical arguments, it's often not enough to change their minds.
Right. We tend to think of ourselves as making these rational choices. But the reality is that things like emotional appeals and the perceived credibility or trustworthiness of the source, those things often play a much bigger role in shaping our views.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that these techniques, they're not always used for good, right?
Right.
I mean, think about propaganda. Aronson gives some really chilling examples of how these principles of persuasion can be used to manipulate people and promote really harmful ideologies.
He does, yeah. I mean, let's take fear appeals, for instance. This is something we see all the time in political advertising.
Right.
Where, they're trying to scare voters into, supporting a particular candidate by highlighting, all these, potential negative consequences if their opponent gets elected.
Right. They're playing on our anxieties, our fears.
Yeah. And then repetition.
Oh, repetition is huge, right?
It is. It's like the more we hear something, even if it's not true, the more likely we are to start believing it.
It's like the old saying, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth.
Right. Familiarity breeds acceptance or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the influence of authority figures, right? I mean, we tend to trust people who are in positions of power or experts in their field.
Right.
Or even celebrities, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we see it all the time in advertising.
Yeah.
Some famous athlete or actor endorses a product. And suddenly we're more likely to buy it.
Right, right. We kind of sometimes bypass our own critical thinking and defer to these figures that we perceive as being, authoritative or credible.
Right. And Aronson even goes into some pretty disturbing historical examples, right?
He does.
Like Nazi propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
to show how these techniques can be used to sway public opinion on a massive scale.
Yeah.
And lead people to accept some truly horrific ideas.
It's scary.
It is, yeah. It's a reminder of how powerful persuasion can be.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to obedience.
Okay.
Which is, the tendency to follow instructions or orders, even when those instructions seem to conflict with, maybe our own moral compass.
Right.
So what is it that makes us obey?
Well, this brings us to Stanley Milgram, right?
Yeah.
And his very famous, very controversial obedience experiments,
Yeah.
which Aronson discusses in some detail.
Yeah.
Can you kind of remind us how those experiments worked?
Yeah, so basically participants in Milgram's study were told that they were taking part in an experiment on learning, and they were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another person who was actually an actor.
Okay.
Every time that person answered a question incorrectly.
Got it.
And the shocks started at a fairly low level,
Mm-hmm.
but they increased with each wrong answer
Okay.
up to levels that were, clearly marked as dangerous.
Wow. So what were the findings of this research?
Well, the really kind of disturbing finding was that the majority of the participants continued to administer these increasingly severe shocks.
Oh, wow.
Even when the learner, quote unquote learner,
Right.
was, screaming in pain,
Wow.
protesting, eventually falling silent.
They just kept going.
They kept going. They obeyed the instructions of the experimenter, the authority figure who was in the room with them, even though it seemed to be, totally at odds with their own empathy and moral sense.
That's really unsettling.
It is, yeah.
So what does this tell us about human nature? I mean, about our willingness to obey authority?
Well, it suggests that we have a very strong, almost innate tendency to obey people who we perceive as being, in a position of authority.
Yeah.
Even when those orders clash with, our own sense of right and wrong.
Yeah. It's like the presence of an authority figure kind of overrides our own internal moral compass.
Yeah. It kind of diffuses our sense of personal responsibility in a way.
Yeah, I get that.
It's like, well, I'm just following orders.
Right.
So I'm not really accountable for what happens.
Yeah, I'm just a cog in the machine.
Right, exactly. And Aronson draws this really disturbing but important connection between, these findings and things like, war crimes.
Right.
Where, seemingly ordinary people can participate in these horrific acts simply because they're, following orders from above.
It's a sobering thought for sure.
It is, yeah. It makes you really question, how far that tendency to obey can go.
It does. It does. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something called cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
Which is another really important concept that Aronson explores. And it helps explain why we sometimes hold on to our beliefs so tightly, even when faced with evidence that contradicts them.
Yeah. So what exactly is cognitive dissonance?
So dissonance, this is a state of discomfort, right?
Okay.
That we experience when we hold two conflicting beliefs.
Okay.
Or when our behavior doesn't match up with our beliefs.
So it's like that feeling of tension you get when there's a mismatch between what you're thinking and what you're doing.
Exactly. Like, for example, you might believe that it's important to be environmentally friendly, but then you find yourself driving a gas-guzzling SUV.
Right. Yeah.
That creates dissonance.
Okay. So how do we try to deal with this kind of discomfort?
Well, according to Aronson, we have a couple of options. We can either change our behavior.
Right.
So in that example, you could trade in your SUV for a more fuel-efficient car.
Right.
Or, and this is what often happens, we can change our beliefs.
Oh, so you kind of rationalize it away.
Exactly. We come up with justifications for our behavior.
Okay.
So you might start telling yourself, well, I need a big car for safety reasons, or I only drive short distances, so it doesn't really matter.
Right.
You're basically changing your beliefs to reduce that dissonance.
So can you give us a few more real-world examples of cognitive dissonance in action?
Sure. One classic example is something called post-purchase rationalization.
Okay.
So imagine you've just spent a lot of money on something, like a new TV.
Okay.
You might start focusing on all the amazing features of that TV and downplaying any drawbacks to convince yourself that you made the right decision.
Yeah, I've definitely done that.
Right. We all have. Another example is hazing rituals.
Oh.
So, fraternities and sororities, they often put new members through these really painful or embarrassing initiations. And one way that people deal with the dissonance of going through these awful experiences is to convince themselves that the group must be really special.
Oh, I see.
Right. Otherwise, why would they have gone through all that?
Yeah.
It's a way of justifying the suffering.
So it's like, well, if this group wasn't super valuable, then I wouldn't have, endured all this pain to get into it.
Exactly. And dissonance can also play a role in things like prejudice and discrimination. Aronson talks about how people often dehumanize others to justify treating them poorly.
So if you can convince yourself that someone is less than human, then it becomes easier to mistreat them.
Exactly. It reduces the dissonance.
Yeah. And what's really, I think, kind of eye-opening about all of this is that this need to reduce dissonance can really lead to some pretty stubborn and irrational behavior.
You can, yeah.
It's like we'd rather cling to our false beliefs than admit that we were wrong.
Right. Because admitting you were wrong creates dissonance.
Right. And who wants to feel that, that tension and discomfort?
Right. It's much easier to just double down on our existing beliefs.
Right. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about prejudice.
Okay.
Which is, a huge issue in social life. So why do we stereotype others?
Yeah, and one of the things that Aronson points out is that prejudice, it doesn't always involve outright hatred or hostility.
Right.
A lot of times it's much more subtle.
Yeah, it's like these unconscious biases that we might not even be aware of.
Exactly. We might have these negative associations with certain groups of people without even realizing it.
Yeah. And so where do these prejudices come from? Like, how do we develop them?
Well, Aronson talks about a few different sources.
Okay.
One is social learning.
Okay.
We learn from our parents, our friends, the media, all the messages that we're exposed to in our culture.
Right. So it's like we're absorbing these biases from a very young age.
Exactly. It becomes part of our worldview without us even thinking about it. Another factor is something called in-group bias.
Okay.
This is our tendency to favor people who are like us.
Okay.
So people who belong to the same groups that we do, whether it's our race or religion or political affiliation.
Right.
We tend to see them as better or more trustworthy.
Us versus them, kind of.
Right, exactly. and this bias, it can be really subtle.
Yeah.
But it can have a big impact on our behavior.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's scapegoating.
Right.
Which is basically blaming our problems on outsiders.
Yeah, it's a way of making sense of difficult situations.
Right.
By finding someone to blame.
Right. So like in times of economic hardship, for instance.
Exactly. People might start blaming immigrants for taking their jobs.
Yeah.
Or they might blame a particular religious group for some perceived social ill.
Right. It's a way of, channeling those frustrations and anxieties.
Right. It gives people a sense of control in a situation where they might feel powerless.
Yeah. But thankfully, Aronson doesn't just leave us with this, bleak picture of prejudice.
Right.
He also talks about, ways to reduce it.
He goes, yeah.
And one really interesting example is his work on the jigsaw classroom.
Yeah, this is a really cool idea.
Can you explain a little bit about how that works?
Sure. So the jigsaw classroom, it's a teaching technique.
Okay.
Where students are divided into small groups.
Okay.
And each student in the group is given a piece of information that's essential for completing a task.
Okay.
So they have to work together. They have to share their knowledge to be successful.
So they're all interdependent.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And what Aronson found was that this type of cooperative learning, it can actually reduce prejudice.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Because it forces students from different backgrounds to work together towards a common goal.
Yeah.
And they start to see each other as individuals.
Yeah.
Not just as members of a particular group.
Right. It kind of breaks down those, those stereotypes and those barriers.
Exactly. And the key takeaway here, I think, is that just putting people from different groups in contact with each other, it's not enough.
Right.
You need to have them cooperate.
Yeah.
You need to give them a shared goal.
Yeah.
To really foster understanding and reduce prejudice.
Okay, let's talk about aggression.
Okay.
why do people hurt each other?
Yeah, this is a big question, right? A really complex question.
Yeah.
And Aronson explores this in a really nuanced way. He challenges the idea that aggression is just this purely instinctual or biological drive.
Right.
And instead, he looks at all these different factors that can contribute to aggression.
Okay.
So things like frustration, right? When we feel like our goals are being blocked or we're not getting what we want.
Yeah.
That can lead to aggression.
Yeah, it's like that feeling of, being thwarted or stuck.
Yeah. Exactly. Another factor is de-individuation.
Okay.
This is when people lose their sense of individual identity.
Okay.
And they become more likely to act impulsively.
Okay.
Often aggressively.
So like in a mob situation.
Exactly. When people are part of a large group,
yeah,
they feel anonymous.
Right.
They lose their inhibitions,
okay,
and they're more likely to do things that they wouldn't normally do.
Right. It's like the psychology of the crowd takes over.
Exactly. And of course, Aronson also talks about the role of media violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's a controversial topic.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of research that suggests that exposure to violence in movies, in TV shows, and video games, it can desensitize people to violence.
Right.
And it can make them more likely to act aggressively themselves.
Yeah.
Now, there's still some debate about how strong this effect is.
Right.
But it's definitely something to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of common sense that if you're constantly exposed to violence, you're going to become more, numb to it.
Exactly. You become desensitized.
And maybe more likely to, to act aggressively yourself.
Yeah. But again, Aronson, he's not a pessimist.
Right.
He believes that aggression is not inevitable.
Right.
It's not something that we're just hardwired to do.
So what can we do to reduce it?
Well, he talks about the importance of things like education.
Okay.
Teaching people how to resolve conflicts peacefully.
Mm-hmm.
And promoting empathy.
Okay.
Helping people to understand the perspectives of others.
Right. So it's not just about, suppressing aggression. It's about, creating a culture that values, understanding and compassion.
Exactly. And establishing social norms that discourage violence.
Yeah. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the social animal,
mm-hmm.
what are some of the big takeaways that you think listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that we are all profoundly shaped by our social environment
mm-hmm.
and by our own internal biases.
Yeah.
Often in ways that we're not even aware of.
Right. We're not always as rational and objective as we think we are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we've seen how powerful authority can be.
Yeah.
How it can lead us to do things that we might never imagine ourselves doing.
Right. We've also seen how cognitive dissonance can distort our thinking.
Yeah.
And lead us to cling to false beliefs,
mm-hmm.
even in the face of evidence to the contrary.
Right. We've learned that prejudice is largely a learned phenomenon
mm-hmm.
and that it can be unlearned.
Right.
Through things like cooperative learning.
Yeah.
And we've seen how aggression, well, it's part of the human experience.
Yeah.
It's not inevitable.
Right.
There are things we can do to reduce it.
Mm-hmm. So understanding these principles of social psychology, it can really empower us.
It can.
Yeah, it can help us to make better decisions, to be more resistant to manipulation.
Yeah.
And to create a more just and compassionate world.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So if you're, if you're interested in learning more about these fascinating topics, we highly recommend checking out The Social Animal by Elliot Aronson.
Absolutely. It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, you can find a link to the book in the show notes.
Yeah, and be sure to subscribe to Books and Bites so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
As you go about your day-to-day, just think about all the social influences that are shaping your thoughts and your behavior.
Yeah, it's a lot more than you might realize.
It is. And maybe, just maybe, this awareness will help you make slightly different choices.
Yeah, that's the hope.